In a relationship, when is honesty not the best policy? How do you balance what you want versus what you need? And is there something you need to say to your spouse, but can't find the right way to say it? If so, then you're in the right place. This is the Lunch with Sandy podcast. With nearly 20 years of marriage under their belts, Terrence and Sandy Jackson discuss a range of topics, provide valuable insights on relationships, and talk about the conversations married couples need to have. So what does lunch have to do with all of this? Well, it's a metaphor for how these conversations originally started. Speaking of conversations, let's get one going. Here's your hosts, Terrence and Sandy.
Welcome to another episode of the Lunch with Sandy podcast, where we delve into various topics and offer insight from the perspective of a married couple. I'm Terrence.
And I'm Sandy.
And today I want to introduce a concept that I thought that I came up with, but after some research, I found that somebody else had talked about it before, and that is the concept of a term marriage. But before we get into that, please remember to follow the Lunch with Sandy podcast on your favorite podcasting app. Also, make sure you go ahead and follow us on all social media at Lunch with Sandy. Sandy, why are you looking at me like that?
How am I looking at you?
You're looking at me like, I don't know. You got something to say, but you don't know what it is.
Oh, no. My leg hurts. I don't know. Back-to-back weeks of over 7 miles, I guess.
You're getting old. I don't think you should be running 7 miles. Listen, not everybody can be vintage like me. Not everybody can age like a fine wine like me. You sitting
don't
over
even
there.
like wine. You're not a fine wine.
I didn't say drinking fine wine. I said age like a fine wine.
You have to drink the wine to age like fine wine.
No, that's not true.
That's true.
You have to drink the wine to be a wino.
Nope. Because you need that alcohol content. So
you can get alcohol content from many other things other than wine. And I don't want to go too far left with your conversation. Just look, you cannot be like me in all ways. You're over there, you're breaking down. Stop running 7 miles if it's going to put you in the position that you're in right now. I don't like the way you're looking at me. I don't know that.
Well, you shouldn't at this point. I don't like the way I'm looking at you. But
you start talking about your leg hurting and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
anyway,
it sounds like you're making fun of my medical condition.
I don't know what medical condition you have.
My compartment syndrome. That's why my leg hurts.
I'm not making fun of anyone's medical condition. And at this point, we're just going to move on. We're not even going to ask Sandy how she's doing anymore. We know that she's ailing, she's old, and she's falling apart.
Yep.
See, this is a perfect example of how marriage is a beautiful thing. We talk about it all the time. But as much as
us bickering?
Well, I mean, listen, that wasn't bickering. That was banter. There's a big difference.
Okay.
That was banter back and forth. Now, there are a lot of situations or a lot of marriages that are in situations where people do a lot of bickering. And that bickering can lead to divorce.
Yep.
Did you know that in the United States, the divorce rate is around 50%?
Yeah.
That is crazy. That's like flipping a coin. When you get married, while you walk up there, you flip that coin. We're going to make it or we're not going to make it. That's essentially what it is.
Right, heads or tails?
Heads, we keep it going. Tails, we don't. Now, you know, traditionally, and I know that from your perspective and your religion, you know, your idea of marriage is a very traditional idea behind marriage. But traditionally, marriage is a lifelong commitment. So all these people out there flipping the coin and it's going tails, they're not following along or they're not going down that path of that lifelong commitment.
Well, or they just decide to, just find a new one.
Well, I mean, listen, so it's funny because, you know, as part of your vows, you know, you say until death do us part. And that is supposed to reaffirm that commitment.
I wonder if all marriage vows do that.
So we're going to get into that for a second, but let me ask you this. I already know the answer to this. You follow the path of someone who
I was gonna say, yeah, you might want to rethink the way that
you
question
follow the
was
path.
going.
You follow the path of someone who is going down the traditional marriage route. So how do you think you avoid the pitfalls of not being in a situation where it's not until death do you part?
Just don't get married. Then you're not saying any vows.
Well, see, now I, in my infinite wisdom, have come up with an alternative.
Okay.
So this is the time of year where we're getting close to the end of our fiscal. And as we get close to the end of the fiscal, there are a lot of contracts that we have to renew.
Yep.
For a number of different things, warranty, support, services, and all of those things. And I got to thinking, what if marriage was termed? Two people come together. Because think about it. When it comes down to it, marriage can be boiled down to its bare essentials as a contract between two people.
Yeah.
There's legal aspects to it. From the perspective of ramifications, if you decide to do something you ain't supposed to do, and now you got to go through that whole process of getting out with it. But if it was a term, what happens is at the end of that term, like all the contracts that we're currently renewing, we look back at that service and we decide,
Did you service me well?
Listen. I'm not talking about servicing nobody over here. I'm talking about at some point before you renew that contract, you look back and see if the value is actually worth it for that actual contract.
It's almost like a prenup with a probationary period.
So listen. What I'm trying to say is most contracts have a term limit.
Yeah.
And you may get into a contract and be extremely happy with it. And you plan on renewing over and over and over. But you may get into a contract and after a year realize that the service sucks.
Yep.
And if that's the case, you're not going to actually renew it. So do you think that there are some people out there who would consider a term agreement when it comes to marriage for a certain number of years?
Yeah, well, I guess why not, right? If you guys can just sit down.
We mean you guys.
Well, I mean, the people who apparently would, be the proponent of a term contract, not you specifically, but,
Imagine this.
In Rhode Island, it's if it's not me, it's you guys.
Yeah.
So.
Imagine this. You walk up to the altar and instead of saying until death do us part, you say until 2027. Upon which date we will decide whether or not we will renew our vows.
Yeah.
Here's the thing.
You can have
how you're always talking about it.
Every time you renew your vows.
Exactly. Now, it may get a little expensive depending on who's paying for it.
Well, you don't have to have a huge party. It
but here's the thing.
Be a party.
You always talk about you want to renew your vows.
Well, that's because, the wedding day just goes by so fast that.
Well, it goes by so fast and it costs a lot of money. Anyway, yeah. I think obviously there's some logistics that, you got to get to. But we're going to get into that in a minute. But
yeah, I think if you can sit down rationally and talk about things in advance and then just say, okay, in 5 years, we're going to reassess the situation.
I think that there are certain people who would jump at that opportunity, right? And again, I think there's some things that you have to consider. But when you look at it, I was saying this the other day, life's about options, right? One of the things that as you start to mature into an adult, you start to think about it is once you get a family and things going, you start to think about insurance, life insurance, right? Yeah. And what types of life insurance? What are the two primary types of life insurance that are out there?
Yeah, there's life and
whole life,
term,
and term life. So why can't there be two types of marriages out there?
Whole life, term life, marriage,
and term life. So look, when I think about this concept, and it's funny because, like I said, I had this idea and I was like, oh, I don't think anyone else has thought about this. And I did some research and there were two people who actually had, at least online, wrote something about the idea of a term marriage. I think that there's some benefits that can come out of a term marriage, right? And I think the biggest actually is, I think a term marriage could decrease the impact of divorce and the stigma that it actually brings. And I'll tell you why. In many cases, right? Two people, they get married, it don't work out. They get divorced. Now they're divorcees. they got, is it not true? They got that label that's on them.
Yeah.
And when you say, oh, I'm divorced, people might not say it out loud, but they start to think, oh, well, what'd you do? Or what happened?
Yeah.
There is a negative connotation when you start talking about divorce. Now, think about it from this perspective. If I say I do until 2026,
yeah,
and I live out that, we work out through that term,
would you
and there's an
consider
expiration
yourself
date.
Single again?
Huh?
I said, so instead of saying divorcee, are you just single again?
I'm single. The contract ran out. We didn't renew. Listen,
I was recently in a term marriage, but we decided to not renew that contract.
If there's a predetermined point and you get the opportunity to review the relationship, right? And you understand that things evolve and things change over time. Mm-hmm. If those changes don't fit who you are, or they don't fit, the construct of the relationship again, you just agree to go your separate ways. Yeah. And it's not really a divorce because, again, we got married until this date. And once that date comes, it dissolves. Now, I get it. I know it's simpler than that, but from the perspective of that impact of saying, oh, I'm divorced, you just say, nah, I'm free. I'm single again.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think about, even with employers having a year-end performance review. So instead of a year-end performance review, it's a end of contract performance review.
Now you coming around because you have to have that end of. I got to come up with a term for it. That it's your current relationship score. If your current relationship score does not reach a particular level that the parties agree upon beforehand, that opens the door to end the relationship. Now, you can obviously decide whether or not you want to continue with it continue with the marriage. But if your scores ain't cutting it, you don't pass.
Maybe there's language that says if the score doesn't cut it, you don't go a full 5-10 years or something. It's
now we're going to get into we can talk about some of the details that you have to think about, but
I think one of the benefits is right when emotion gets involved is usually where it gets a little dicey.
This will reduce emotion.
Right. So if you're working out this term contract, you're taking the emotion out because both parties are content at that moment in time, and nobody's trying to
when that there's
be upset at the other one.
When that there's an end date or an expiration date on your relationship, on your marriage, and that the service just ain't there, it is a relief. It removes any emotional burden. It's a relief because now okay, well, this thing that I'm in sucks, but guess what? It's coming to an end.
So it's funny because it does make me think, would it actually cause people to, not renew their term? Like, hey, this is not working out. Where maybe some people tend to stay together longer in marriages thinking that like, okay, well, we're going to really work harder and everything for it. But knowing to the point that like, listen, this contract is over in 5 years. Like, we already made that decision. Like, there's no point in trying to renew this.
Well, I think it depends on a big part of it does depend on how the relationship is, right? For a fact that there are people who try to make a relationship work for whether it be for societal reasons, whether it be from pressure from family or peers. And so they put in this effort to try to actually make it work when they're not doing it because the relationship score has reached the number that it should have reached. They're doing it because there's outside pressure. Now, when you're in this situation where that there's actually an end date, and again, you're in a situation that it's just not working for you, it can be a relief because now you know, hey, listen.
Like, right, I'm out.
I'm out.
On this date. Like, it's done.
And the thing about that is it can make it more amicable for both parties because you both know that this date is actually coming up.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go through that emotional stress like you would if there was actually a divorce. When you're in a situation and you're in a traditional marriage and you get a divorce, nobody plans for the divorce. You don't go in and say, when we get divorced, it's this. However, when you start talking about a term marriage, now there's things that you actually have to consider. And we'll talk about, some of those things in a minute. But the other thing that this actually does for you is it does give you a lot of flexibility, right? So when I say flexibility, I mean, you always have the opportunity to reassess and renegotiate once that term actually comes up. Let's say you want to actually continue once your expiration date comes up. But there are certain things that you feel just weren't right or certain areas where someone needs to work to get that score up.
Yeah.
Go to the negotiating table.
Or it sounded like a good idea when you thought of it and maybe it's not practical.
Yeah, I mean, if you're satisfied at the end of the term, you can keep going.
Kind of makes me think of like the Big Bang Theory and the
Roommate agreement.
agreement.
I believe he also did have a girlfriend agreement too.
I think he did. But yeah, well, honestly, I think any agreement is not a bad idea because it really has you thinking about things in advance of.
That's a great example because you know what? When you get all lovey-dovey and get married, you don't think about a lot of things.
No.
Well, I don't want to say you don't think about a lot of things. You don't plan for a lot of things.
Right.
And
all the things we plan for in life. Yeah, it's not one of those things that we do plan. You think about it. We do trusts, we do wills. Like there's so many other type of agreements and legal documents that we put together that, yeah, marriage is not even one of the, which should be like one of the most important ones.
Yeah, and I think that you touched on it earlier. When you have, I'm bringing you over. It's funny because I'll be at work and I have all these ideas. And these ideas, some of them are money makers, but people don't want to get on board. They're shy about pulling the trigger. Term marriages, I'm going to tell you right now, they're going to start taking off. People are going to hear this, they're going to start taking off. Now, again, there has to be a lot more planning when you talk about a term marriage. Because again, if you already know that there's an expiration date, you got to start planning for that expiration date.
Do you have like an executor like you do for a will? Like a third party to just handle everything so you don't even have to communicate with one another.
So you can. And so I'm not gonna pretend like there are not some challenges, right? But again, I look at every challenge as an actual opportunity. So what type of challenges, and you started to mention one or two of them, but what type of challenges do you think that you would have if, you decided to adopt this concept of term marriage?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is honestly if you end up having kids in that first, so maybe that's part of the agreement is that you shouldn't have kids before the first renewal period.
Well, see, now, here's the thing. You brought up a very, very good point. And what I would say is, I would say that you have to talk about your actual plan. And you not just talking about the actual plan, but actually planning. Because again, how long is the term that I'm committed to?
Yeah.
And during that initial term, have we had the conversation about children? And additionally, even if you haven't had the conversation about children, you have to plan for what happens if.
Right.
Because when I look at it, I do say, well, the biggest challenge would be children. But at the same time, people get married all the time and they don't stay together.
Yeah.
They get divorced and they actually have children.
It's not like it's not doable, but I think it's just easier so you're not going through like any kind of custody situation if you have it ironed out already in advance, Okay.
Yeah. And I think that the other part about it too is, you always have to consider the impact on the children. And that's not just for a term marriage, because when you think about it, you know what a divorce is? Mm-hmm. It's just a traditional marriage that was forced to be termed. I mean, think about it. Think about it.
For one reason
it's
or
termed.
another.
it's a unplanned termed marriage.
Yeah.
And so when you start thinking about the impact that it can have on the kids, it's really the same thing. I think from the perspective of if a split is amicable,
Right.
I think it's a little easier on the children because now it's amicable. They don't see any of the vitriol that might be spewed between, the two parties. But that would be a challenge.
I think it's a challenge and a benefit because I feel like with the unplanned term of the marriage, like there tends to be less amicability, especially.
Oh yeah, well,
especially if it's one party more than the other that wishes to term the marriage. You know what I mean? If they both realize that it's the best thing to do. I know I've seen plenty of marriages that way, but I can't say that it's what I've seen as the majority.
Yeah.
I feel like the majority is the other, where it's not so pretty and nice and easy.
Yeah. So one of the things that I always think about is, again, there's so many people who decide to get divorced, and whether or not you're in a situation where you're in a term marriage where you can decide whether or not you want to renegotiate or renew a contract. Yeah. And you're at the table, or you both say, hey, listen, this isn't working out, and you walk away, on your own terms. I still think that that's better than just coming up and saying, you know what, I'm out.
So, and then I would say too, with the kids is also the pets.
Well, again,
like who gets Jax?
This gives you the opportunity to plan for those things. I think
that would not be a pretty fight on who gets Jax.
Well, I don't think that there's a choice. I think Jax is walking out the door with me.
No.
So
I don't think so.
As he's looking at me right now.
As he's looking at you and as he was waking me up this morning.
I think another challenge that would be secondary to the impact on kids. And I only say secondary because if you have kids, then, you really got to be careful with that. And that is,
because you have that third person to really think about.
Yeah. And that is the whole, the commitment aspect of it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're in a situation where you say, okay, well, you know what? I do until 2027. Are you looking to the future and saying, I'm only doing this for this many years, and you're not really buying into the concept of a term marriage from the perspective of, okay, well, we're in love. We want to do this, but we know that things change. So let's commit to this amount of time. And, if it works, great. If there's some things that we have to work on, we can bring those to the negotiating table and move on. Or you just say, yeah, you know what? I'm married, but in 3 years, a brother's out.
Well, maybe that's something that you stipulate in the contract is all the renewal periods.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. You can't put that in the contract because the contract is only for a set period of time.
Yeah, but if you choose to renew, like these are your options for renewal in the future. Like first one's in 5 years, then it's 10, then another 10.
Yeah, but after the first one, you just don't renew and you're out.
Yeah. But I don't know. Like
now, here's the thing: a term marriage doesn't stop you from it. It should decrease the chances of divorce, but it's not going to stop someone from getting divorced.
I don't know.
Particularly, you might be in a situation where,
so you're
let's
saying
say,
lack of commitment.
I'm saying, lack of a commitment. It's just one of those things where someone is vibing with someone.
Yeah.
At the time when they enter into this agreement, and they're entering into the agreement with the understanding that, you know what, I'm gonna do this because, he or she wants to do this, but it's only for this amount of time. So after this time, I'll be out. And in those situations, they may not be willing to work through any small issues that actually may come up because they know that there's an expiration date.
Right. Well, honestly, yeah. So for me, I wouldn't get too emotionally invested in the relationship.
See, now you're not buying into the true concept of a term marriage.
Yeah. Well, that's just how I would, because I don't want to get my feelings hurt
Well, here's the thing.
at the end.
See, now what I'm learning is this. You have to be a very self-confident, mature person to enter into a term
Are
marriage.
you calling me not
No.
self-confident or not mature?
No. Here's what I mean by this. When I talk about this term, I'm talking about it from the perspective of, okay, we see what's happening with marriages throughout this country. We see that they're failing at a very, very high rate.
Yep.
Now, we would all like to say that we're actually different, but what if we're not? So let's go into this and say, here's what we're going to do. We want to be committed to each other. We want to spend the rest of our lives with each other, but let's block this amount of time out and say, we are going to commit to be married for this period of time. And hopefully it's all cracked up to be. We can work through things and all this other stuff. But if it's not, and we're just like everybody else,
Yeah.
we walk away.
Well, I guess we would need a case study for the first one to figure out how it works.
You don't need no case study. It's all based on, listen, it's a termed marriage is not a get out of jail free card. You can't look at it that way. I mean, eventually it is, but it's not something where you're going to say, hey, listen, I'm only doing this, although people will, because I know I'm going to get out of it. It's one of those things where you're saying, I love this person, but I know that this person might change. I might change. The environmental factors around us might change. Work might change and it might drive us apart. Those are all questions that we don't know. So let's prepare for that by saying, let's do this for this many years. And hopefully we can renew and renew and renew and renew. But let's do this for this many years. And let's hope that these are the best 3 years that we've ever had.
lives.
And then when it comes up, boom, we do it again. And then we do it again. That's the concept. It's not, you know what? I'm going to get married for 3 years and be out. It's really looking at making sure that, one, two people who are getting married really know and understand each other. And they have the time to say, okay, well, we're going to give this a real shot. And if it doesn't work, then at that renewal period, we walk away.
Yeah.
And you plan for it by making sure that when you get involved in this, knowing that there's an end date, you do all the necessary things, you know, whether it be, and this is a challenge too, because you got to think about this stuff up front. All the legal complexities that you have to be concerned with, and all the financial complexities that you would have to be concerned with during a divorce, you plan for that prior to getting into the actual term marriage. You got to actually plan for that.
End of term party.
There you go. End of term party. You know what I mean? See, now you're living it up.
One last hurrah all together before the term ends.
Yeah, so I say all that, and that leads me to one final challenge that I think that has to be considered, and that is differing expectations between two people, right? So I say, when I talk about this concept, the concept that I'm coming up with, it's not so much where, hey, I'm going to get married for 3 years and be out. It's, okay, well, I understand that a relationship is all about work. I understand that I can't change people, but I do understand that as human beings, as individuals, as couples, we grow and evolve, and something might cause us to actually grow apart, and I'm going to put in all the work to keep us together. If the other person's going to put in the work, or maybe they won't put in the work, but at the end of the day, when we get to that renewal period and we look at the relationship score, if it's not where it needs to be, we got the decision to actually be out. Now, if I'm thinking that way and you're thinking, nah, I'm just doing this bid.
I'm just,
I'm gonna do this quick bid and then I'm gonna be out.
yeah.
Then, you know, that's a challenge, because now that person's not looking at it looking at the concept of a term marriage the same way as you are. And they're only in it just because they want to do their
bucket list
2-3 years. Exactly. Or their bucket list. I want to get married and then be out.
I think you have to require marriage counseling.
Listen, that's not a bad idea.
Before the term ceases, and you have to have, a conversation like 6 to 12 months in advance, like a progress report.
Well, I think the first thing is when your term shouldn't be a year.
No, I just
think
mean
the initial
like
term should be
like
3 to 5 years.
Should be like progress reports along the way to make sure that you're still seeing eye to eye.
Listen, I'm all about it. You got to start working on these
things. A
things.
report card, and just find out if you actually pass to the next.
Well,
level.
I think that all those things actually make sense. I think that in order to be in a term marriage, you have to start thinking about all those things. I do think that this concept would change the way that people actually think about marriage.
Right.
And I think that in many cases, people would put more thought into, okay, what are the what ifs?
Yeah. How many times did you go to bed mad at each other? You have to reduce your total score by that many.
Oh, goodness. All right, we're gonna wrap this up because we can go on.
What ifs? You know what I mean?
Yeah, we can go on all day with all of those things. So essentially, the key to success in any relationship lies in the ability to prioritize the well-being and happiness of both parties involved. It requires communication, honesty, fostering that connection, and the continual nurturing of each relationship over time. Whether it be traditional or a term marriage, marriage takes work. The goal is to promote healthy, fulfilling relationships based on mutual respect, communication, and shared understanding. And if you can accomplish this, your union has the potential to last a very, very long time. Thank you for joining us on the Lunch with Sandy podcast. Please be sure to follow us and leave feedback on your favorite podcasting app, as well as social media at Lunch with Sandy. Until next time, stay well.
That's it for this week's episode of the Lunch with Sandy podcast. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your feedback and comments on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Lunch with Sandy. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us. Thanks again for listening to the Lunch with Sandy podcast.